Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to our regularly scheduled live stream programming here on another Thursday at 10 a.m. in Santa Fe. I hope you're all doing well out there and enjoying the onset of spring. It's certainly windy, but we know this, and it's always windy. And I hope your allergies are all under control out there. So, of course, we have a really big event coming your way next week. It's, of course, on Wednesday, and it is our annual gala. And we will be featuring a number of different things along the theme of the evolution of global education. We'll hear from a lot of our amazing high school students. We have a couple other nice surprises in store for you. And then, of course, we have the big conversation between former FBI Director Jim Comey and former CIA officer Valerie Plame, who go back many years together, and should be a fantastic conversation. We had a slight delay in getting the books with the signatures in them. Those are getting mailed out today. So if you're waiting for your book, this is Comey's latest book. It is in the mail and will be hitting your mailbox very, very soon. So I hope you can join us. It's Wednesday, April 21st. It's our only fundraiser of the year, and it should be a really great one. And we look forward to welcoming you in then. So on the topic of welcoming in, why don't we go to today's speakers? And we have two speakers for us today. One is our very familiar moderator, Vicki, who I'll introduce in a second. But first, let me introduce Ambassador Derek Mitchell. Good morning, Ambassador Mitchell. It's great to have you with us here today.
Thank you, Sandy, and good morning, Santa Fe.
So let me just quickly read Derek's bio. He is in the National Democratic Institute's, I hope I got that right, third president. Beginning in September 2018, he returned to NDI after 2 decades from his departure from the Institute in 1997. From 2012 to 2016, he served as the U.S. ambassador to the Republic of the Union of Myanmar. He was America's first ambassador to the country in 22 years. And previous to that, he served as the U.S. Department of State's first special representative and policy coordinator for Burma with the rank of ambassador. And then moderating today's discussion is the one and only Vicki Huddleston. Good morning, Vicki.
Hey, Sandy.
And Vicki's bio I know so well, I can chime it right off. She was the leader of 4 U.S. diplomatic missions abroad in Cuba, Mali, Madagascar, and Ethiopia, amongst many other things. And Vicki, we're delighted as always to have you back on the stage. Let me turn things over to you now and remind folks out there to drop your questions into the Q&A box. And we do have a special video featuring voices from the ground on Myanmar that we're going to show at some point during today's live stream. So Vicki, over to you.
Thank you, Sandy. We are so fortunate to have Ambassador Mitchell this morning, and congratulations. You have just published in Foreign Affairs. Literally, it came out this morning, a really timely and well-written article, The Looming Catastrophe in Myanmar, and the subtitle, Failure to Act Will Lead to a Failed State. And that's just exactly what we're going to talk about today. So I just wanted to flag it right up front because it's a great article, and congratulations for getting it in Foreign Policy.
Thank you. I timed it precisely for Santa Fe, so I'm glad I got it. We can send a link somehow for folks to see. But thank you, Vicki, for that.
Yeah, thank you. I want to begin by talking a bit about your career, which is really very impressive. You worked in the Senate for Senator Edward Kennedy. You worked for the Center for Strategic and International Study, and you worked at Defense, and you worked at State. So how did you get into foreign affairs, and how did you manage to work in so many different areas?
Vicki, you really are a legend from the State Department, and so thank you very much for the opportunity. Look, my dad asked me the question all the time, how I got into foreign affairs. Where did this come from? Small town, but I always had fascination with, and then in grad school.
Derek, we're having trouble with the audio again. It's so strange.
And I didn't. You are. To me, can you hear me now? Is this okay?
Yep, go ahead.
Yeah. I'm so sorry. For some reason it's happening now. But no, I've had, I didn't have any background in family with foreign affairs, but I found a liking to it from my small town in Connecticut, and then ended up joining. Little by little, I got working at NDI on international democracy. I worked on Capitol Hill, as you say, and then got lucky with the Clinton administration with the political appointment to the Pentagon. And that got me really mixed into the policy realm. And in Washington, you have the revolving door in essence of you're in when your party is in, and then you're out when your party's out. So I joined the think tank and continued my study of Asia, and was able to come back in with the Obama administration, and as an Asianist, continue my Asia work until becoming president of NDI, which was really another huge honor after I finished up in Myanmar. Oh, you're on mute. Yep.
NDI is one of the foremost agencies that are looking at democracy around the world and leading election monitoring. In fact, I know you have an election monitoring coming up on Ethiopia. Tell us a little bit about NDI.
NDI has been around since the Reagan administration, since the early 1980s and the Cold War. And what we do, frankly, is we help countries that are undergoing a transition to democracy with the nuts and bolts of what it takes to be a democracy, which means we help with underwriting and providing comparative experiences on developing a political party, on how to work in a parliament, how civil society is organized, and the interrelationships between civil society and government and a parliament. We help, as you say, help with the observation of elections by building, people may have heard about these delegations of people around the world going to observe an election somewhere. We've organized those for 4 decades to show solidarity with countries and show them we care about how their elections are run, and then provide advice on how to run them better. What it is not, though, is it's not saying we have it perfect in the United States. It's not like we're exporting America or saying we're look at us, aren't we great? We've always had a flawed democracy. Today, we have a more flawed democracy than ever. We always work with humility. And what we do is we take people's experiences in other countries and bring those experiences to those third countries. So 85% of the 55 offices we have around the world, the vast majority of them are not led by Americans. They're led by people from Morocco or Kosovo or Great Britain or Canada or somewhere else. And they bring their particular experience that may be more relevant to a democracy in let's say, Ukraine. And we give them an option. Here are the lessons learned that we have learned, and here are some options you may want to think about. So it really is done with a great deal of humility, but with the idea that there are different forms of democracy, but that there are fundamental values that are essential to democracy and certain institutions that are crucial. And we try and help countries work that through, given their own context and their own cultures.
I have to say that I congratulate you for the position, because I really think it's one of the, if not the foremost institution on promoting democracy around the world. But was NDI involved in the coming to power of Aung San Suu Kyi 10 years ago?
Well, let me say 2 things. One thing I didn't mention that I should have mentioned about NDI. We are affiliated with the Democratic Party. We are not part of the Democratic Party, but we are affiliated. There's an International Republican Institute that's affiliated with the Republican Party, established at the same time in 1983, along with the National Endowment for Democracy, which is a funder of the work that we do. So this is a bipartisan effort. And when we go abroad, we do nonpartisan work. We don't side with any particular party. We don't side with any particular ideology. Our interest is in the process of democracy, and then they decide for themselves what they would like to do with their society. So when it comes to Aung San Suu Kyi, yes, I got to know Aung San Suu Kyi when I first worked with NDI in the 1990s, in 1995. And with my predecessor, Ken Wallach, we met her and fell in love with her, as it were, at the time. And with the cause of Myanmar, Burma, a name for Myanmar. So yes, NDI had been working mostly outside the country when they were a military dictatorship until a decade ago. And then inside Myanmar, when I was ambassador, NDI worked with the parliament, worked on election, worked with a civil society group on election monitoring. And that led to the election then of Aung San Suu Kyi, but we weren't siding with her or anyone else. We were just working the democracy inside the country that led to her election.
And you were, NDI didn't make it happen, but certainly by providing assistance to the parliament and to the population information, you helped see democracy in the form of Aung San Suu Kyi's party come to Myanmar. So that, we're going to get to the really essential things in a minute, but since we brought her up, or I brought her up, and you know her, can you talk a little bit about her? And in particular, so many people were disappointed, this Nobel Prize winner, and then she didn't really speak up on the Rohingya killings or ethnic cleansing, however you want to phrase it. How do you see it?
She's a complex individual. And I think in the old days, we may have projected onto her more than she was, or we projected on some halo and some ideal figure, because we wanted, I think the world needs icons, right? They want an icon for democracy. And in the country, she's an icon for democracy. She still represents the democratic hopes of a majority of the Myanmar people, which is one reason why the rest of us rallied around her, is because in the election, getting to the history of Myanmar, in 1990, her party ran and they won a landslide. And the military said, well, no, that didn't go the way we expected. We're not going to allow that. But that was a referendum on her and on her party. So that's why I think the international community rallied around her. But she was under house arrest for most of the 20 years after that. And so she wrote a bit, and she was out occasionally, but we didn't really know her very well. And when you get to know somebody, you realize they're complicated. And one of the earliest things she told me was, I don't want to be an icon, I'm a politician. And there's nothing wrong about being a politician, but she was very much of, wanting to win elections and win over people. And that means not necessarily as principled as we may have wanted her to be on democracy. And I realized as I got to know her more that she was very much a party person, that she was much less patient with alternative points of view, even within her party. She was impatient with the media, impatient with civil society. And she would say, look, they vote for us, and therefore we should represent the people. These civil society people, who do they represent? They're self-selected leaders. We don't need to listen to them. And I'd have to tell her, well, in a democracy, it doesn't, the people's voice doesn't stop on election day. And I realized while I was there that her ideas of democracy were much more complicated and not as I expected. And then with the Rohingya, I think she didn't understand how to talk about that issue. She's very much a nonviolent person who believes in nonviolence. And I think it definitely offended her sensibilities, but she felt that the world didn't understand the complexity of the Rohingya issue, which is actually true. We don't understand the complexity, but she didn't understand that she needs to be speaking out for the human rights atrocity that was occurring and the genocide that was occurring. And we were kind of speaking past each other. We were saying to her, you don't understand that you need to speak and lead on this human rights atrocity. And she said, you don't understand how complicated this is, and that she herself politically was in a vice because her speaking out on their behalf would lead to a political cost, and potentially, I think, the military doing something, because she would have had to condemn the military action and the coup could have happened sooner. She was in a very difficult situation we can discuss. So we all didn't quite understand each other. and she, I think, handled it quite poorly. But again, that doesn't mean that she is an angel or an icon. She has her own challenges that we have to recognize.
Well, I think you made a really good point there that, she has to contend with the military. Essentially, she's governing with the military. And
Yeah.
had she said, look at these atrocities, they have to stop, she probably would have been out of power. And interestingly enough, not long after the Rohingya tragedy, she is out of power. An election, and her party wins, and that's it. So why is it that the military, and maybe it's self-evident, which has been in power since 1962, why
Right.
is it that the military just can't seem to accept the will of the people?
Well, that gets to a very fundamental issue when it comes to the history of this country and understanding where we are today, or like any country, you need to understand the history as well as other aspects, but certainly the history and how the military views itself. Aung San Suu Kyi's father, by the way, is considered kind of the George Washington and Abraham Lincoln of the country combined. That's how she originally got her aura inside the country. A man named Aung San, who's a general, led the independence movement against British colonialism, established Myanmar's army, which is called the Tatmadaw. So the father of the army that has brutalized her and brutalized her party and now brutalizing the country, father of that army is her father. So she has always felt a kind of actually a soft spot for the military, ironically, even through all of what's gone on. But the military has felt since independence that they are uniquely placed, that they are unique patriots of the country. They are uniquely understand the needs and are putting their lives on the line to hold the country together. That this is a very fractious country that has had the longest running civil war in the world. They've had a civil war raging among their ethnic divisions since 1948 or 1949. And they had independence on January 4th, 1948. So this very fractious place requires something to hold it together. And the military felt after an experiment of democracy in the 1950s, they said, this isn't working, we need to take over in 1962 or this place will fall apart. And they train themselves to believe that they are special. They train their cadets, they train their generals that we have a special place, we're a state within a state. It's sort of like Pakistan, which I know you know, that instead of a country that has a military, the military in Pakistan believes it has a country, that they own the country. And in some ways, it's the same with Myanmar's military. They feel they should be in control. They should have prerogatives. And this democracy thing that they started in the last decade was always a test to see whether the civilians deserve it. Are they able to preserve and protect the country? Now, why did they then the coup? Why then the coup in February 1st? It's a puzzle to a lot of folks because even under the so-called civilian rule, 25% of the parliament was reserved for the military. The military had control of the three key ministries: defense ministry, the interior ministry, and the border ministry. The military still controlled much of the levers of economic power. They had the major corporations and companies of the country. And they had all those prerogatives. Why did they need to effect a coup? And people still wonder, even Myanmar hands are like, I don't know why they needed to do this. But one reason may be that Aung San Suu Kyi and her party were running around them. We're working around them. And the military thought the 2008 Constitution, which embedded all the things I just mentioned, was enough. But Aung San Suu Kyi found a way around it to govern without the military, and they didn't like it. And each time they have an election, the military thinks their party will do reasonably well. And with Aung San Suu Kyi not really living up to expectations the past 5 years, they thought they were going to win, or do well. And Aung San Suu Kyi once again had a landslide victory. So they may feel humiliated. They may feel aggrieved. They may have felt the international community was upset over the Rohingya and didn't support her as much as we did in the past. They may have felt they can get away with something like this as long as they allowed for international investment, and if the military just played a geopolitical game and siding, with the West or whatever. They may have felt that this wouldn't go over the way it did. But they felt, I think, aggrieved, and their pride was offended. And I have a sense that played a big role in this coup, which otherwise is hard to understand according to very, very tangible, practical interests, because they had those essentially being taken care of.
One thing that that it seems to me, and I'm not sure I'm right, so I'm really asking, is the role of both ethnicity and religion. You have like the Bamar population is almost 90%. And then you have these people, Chinese, Rohingya, and others around the periphery. And it seems like Burma, which was Myanmar before it changed its name, and was kind of a consolidated country where you really did have a united religion and ethnicity. But when it became independent, it absorbed these different ethnicities around the perimeter.
Yeah.
And they've attempted to gain either independence or autonomy for the past 50 years, during which the military has been in power. And the military, as you mentioned, has fought these civil wars against them. Is the problem ethnicity and the periphery?
Yeah, and I think you hit it exactly on the head, Vicki. And traditionally we have considered Burma, if we considered it at all, as a democracy issue in the past, say 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago, because of the military coup and the imprisoning of Aung San Suu Kyi and political prisoners. We saw it as a democracy issue, and it is democracy issue to some degree, a great degree. But the founding challenge of the country, the defining challenge of the country, is, as I mentioned, how will this amalgam of different ethnicities and different religions, just vast diversity, very similar to the United States in essence, the diversity that we have, how will it hold together without use of force? The military's theory of the case is you need us, otherwise the country will fall apart. When I first worked on the issue in the 90s, they would say we'll be like Indonesia or Yugoslavia. So we have to be like Indonesia and have a tight military control. Of course, Indonesia then became democratic. They wouldn't use Indonesia anymore as their model, but that's holding together fine with democracy. But they would say we'd fall apart like Yugoslavia. So the argument is the only way to hold together is democracy, is to get everyone equal justice under law, a voice in the political system, representation at the center and in the individual states in the periphery. And that's the way that you build that kind. And this is the theory of democracy generally. This is why democracy works practically, not just as an ideal, but practically by giving people a voice, by allowing them to have a say in the federal system, to work locally, to defend their rights under law. There's a more stable state, and you don't have to fight. You don't have to resort to military means or to policing means or violent means of any kind. But yes, this is the defining challenge. How do they find this unity? And it's a factor, frankly, that divisions in some way of British colonialism. It's not people who understand how the British acted all throughout the world. And you'll see the residue of that everywhere, whether it's in Iraq or Jordan, or these are amalgams, these are collections of different peoples, nations as they were, that were unified by British colonialism. And then the way they would rule is dividing and conquering. They'd win over maybe the minorities to give them certain rights. They bring them into the center to rule at the expense of the majority. So then when independence happened, you can't just say, oh, bygones. The minorities had gotten used to having some authority and being promised by the British that their autonomy would be respected. This is what happened in Myanmar. But the majority had other ideas. And that residue of mistrust, that division that was created through that divide and conquer just flowed over into independence. So they just fight and fight and fight. But it's been 70 years, so they've got to find a better way forward. But this is one of the defining issues, again, that we need to understand as we look at the country. And that British colonial, let me just also add this component because it brings in the Rohingya issue, is that sense of their history says we could fall apart and we have to be worried about major powers. Their geography says we are surrounded by great powers. This is 54 million people surrounded by 3 billion people. In the United States, we were worried for a time about Mexico or about Canada, but they have China on one side, they have India on the other border, they have Bangladesh with 170 million Muslims and a very proudly Buddhist country across a porous border. Their identity is one of insecurity, of vulnerability to outside power, to neighbors that can flow in and overwhelm them demographically and politically, and by great powers from colonial powers that can take away their independence and their pride. And so that mindset of deep sense of nationalism, nationalist pride, and need for sovereign independence, as well as that sense of vulnerability and insecurity, is why they look at the Rohingya as a function of British colonialism and as not a part of the natural fabric, because they saw these people as being brought in by the British, and this was just a legacy of that time. And they feel they're the leading edge of the march of Islam, as they call it, that will overwhelm Burmese Buddhism, as it happened, they say, in Indonesia and Afghanistan through history that are now Muslim countries. So all of this plays in. I'm sorry to go on so long, but all this plays in to this mindset that leads to such violence against the Rohingya and the fighting among ethnicities, and that the military uses as an excuse to say, you need us. That's their excuse. Now, we've seen they're part of the problem, but they will use it consistently as an excuse.
Well, thank you. I'm glad you went on, because you've said geography is the problem. In fact, when we were discussing earlier, you said geography is destiny. I think Napoleon said that too. And Abraham Verghese, who wrote Cutting the Stone on Ethiopia, and Ethiopia is going through something somewhat similar to Myanmar, and geography, and then ethnicity, these people that were added in, particularly the Rohingya, and religion, because as you just mentioned, they're Islamic and Muslim, not Buddhist. So you kind of have this fire cake. And in your article, The Lumen Disaster in Myanmar, you talk so elegantly about what's happening now on the streets of Myanmar and to the people of Myanmar and their brave resistance. So talk a little bit about that. And after you speak about it, I think Sandy has a video that he's going to put on that was done by some of the people here in Santa Fe that belong to CIR.
Wonderful. And I look forward to seeing that video myself. I can't do justice to what people on the ground will say. And those brave people, astoundingly brave people and resourceful people who are pushing back against this coup. And I know many of them. They just won't take it. We just talked about the history and how the country went from being the rice bowl of Asia. It still is extremely fertile country in the Irrawaddy Delta area, which is now low-lying areas that could be overwhelmed by climate change. So they're very alert to climate issues. But they have every mineral imaginable, every gem you can imagine. I mean, rubies and sapphires and jade. Most of the jade goes to China, plus arable land. And so they're the rice bowl of Asia, and they should be really the leaders of Southeast Asia, and they were in the past. But the military after '62 made it into a basket case. I mean, this is an example of how political leadership can destroy a country systematically. So, the last 10 years were a moment of hope and opportunity, where there seemed to be a turning of the corner, where the ditch was dug so deep that it wasn't going to change overnight. No one expected that, but people hoped that there would be progress forward, and a new generation of people had educated and tech savvy. They heard from their parents about the old days, but they were onto something new. So when the military did what they did, this group, led by women, I should say, which is true all over Asia and all over the world, and we should be noting this as the hope of democracy everywhere. Young women, young men are now saying, not on our watch. We're not going to stand for it. We're not going back. We're just not going to do it. And they're leading even the older generation to start a civil disobedience movement. So you have people that have just left their jobs with government, in hospitals. I mean, with teachers, people, banks are closed, and bankers just won't do business. They simply won't take direction from the military. So you're seeing astounding bravery, and the military now is responding with absolutely horrible violence. The kind of violence that occurred to the Rohingya in the shadows, and that was also happening to some of the ethnic minorities we talked about earlier, is happening now on the streets of Rangoon, Yangon, in Mandalay, in the streets all throughout the country. And what the people of the country are just saying is, we don't have weapons. We have no way of defending ourselves. And the military is coming in and murdering us in cold blood for no reason. And you'll see pictures of that. CNN had that. They're asking the world to stand with them and help them and do something. And my article's about how we're not nearly doing enough. The US is doing as much, frankly, as I think we can for the most part, but there are a lot of other countries with more that they can do. But I'd love to see the video and hear them in their own voice about what they're experiencing.
All right, here we go.
The military coup 2 months ago came as a terrible shock. For 10 years, the people of Myanmar has been enjoying a political, economic freedom that others take for granted. Suddenly, it was all taken from us. Many of our elected political leaders were arrested and some beaten to death, imprisoned by the military. At first, people were paralyzed and cautious, but gradually, non-violent protests and civil disobedience campaign has picked up. I have participated with my staff in the protests. A key feature is the use of soldiers in full combat gear against civilians protesting peacefully in residential area. Snipers are used and many are killed by headshot from the rooftop and high-rise building. Some nights we can hardly sleep due to the frightening noise of gunfire in our street. A friend in my Myanmarese protest group was shot dead 2 weeks ago while protesting. It is important that the world understand that the struggle of Myanmar people is much more than an internal issue. This is the struggle of global importance at the central ideas, principle, and credibility of the world is also at stake. It is a struggle between dictatorship and democracy, a struggle between barbarity and civilization, and between God and evil. The world simply cannot accept this kind of blatant and large-scale violation of the basic human right playing out in full view of the cameras. So it is not only our, but also your struggle. Indeed, you can and should assist. If US could take a strong and decisive lead in coordinating Thai international sanctions, the Myanmar people will be immensely grateful. A so-called shadow cabinet representing the elected government has been formed. It is called CRPH, Committee Representing Pitu Luthor. It is coordinating the political struggle. International recognition of this shadow cabinet would mean a lot to us. A safe, credible finance channel for the activity of the cabinet has been set up, and fundraising campaign has been launched. If private and state funding could be provided and gradually increased, it would of great help. So I am urging you as a concerned US citizen and friends of people of Myanmar, please to continue sharing information about what is happening, and people lobby as strongly as you can. Central decision maker to impose the strictest possible sanction on the junta and support our legitimate government. Our demands are just 3 things. And number 1, the army must stop all the violence and release our elected government and negotiate with them. And number 2, full and immediate restoration of the Myanmar democracy. And number 3, all transparent and independent investigation of all crime and committed to a civilian during the last 2.5 months.
So my name is Sai. What I am experiencing about the current situation. I don't even know where to start because it's just so difficult for us. It's very bad. Before March 27, although I march every day and I didn't encounter with the security force before that day, but that day was quite tense and I encountered the security force and we had to hide. So it was almost like the whole day. We hid in all these different places, and I was hiding in one building. Then I picked out the window and I saw they arrested these 5 protesters. So I don't know how other security forces from other countries arrested protesters, but here although all these people surrender themselves to let the security force arrest them, but they still hit them with the back of the gun. It was very bad, and then they couldn't do anything. The protesters couldn't do anything, but they just had to let them hit them, and then they took them away. We don't have any protection, not from the police, not from the military. So we have no one to protect us, but we just have ourselves to protect us every day. The way we protect ourselves is not like fighting back with guns and all these weapons. We just have to play. We just have to like run away and hide. But we know that we cannot always run away. So we are trying to find all the possible way to fight back. I would say that this is pure crime against humanity. So this is what we are experiencing.
Strong words. I have to just quickly say thank you so much to Jim and Irina Goggins for compiling that audio. And they, of course, have a lot of contacts in Myanmar, and that's just disturbing stuff. So back to you, Vicki and Derek.
Well, Derek, this is perfect because that very emotional video brings very much to the front what's happening. But the question is, what should the world be doing? What should ASEAN, the regional organization, what should the United Nations, what should the United States be doing? You argue for action in your article, so please tell us what should be done.
Well, I talk in the article that, well, first of all, the United States has, I think, demonstrated as much leadership as they can. We've imposed targeted sanctions on the military and military businesses. We need to identify what is it that the military holds dear, and what do they care about? The key here is to try to somehow change their calculation, which is going to be hard, but they care about their money, and they would care about their weapons. So best we can through the United Nations or otherwise, an embargo on weapon sales to them. The Russians are a problem in this regard. The Russians sell to anyone and everyone. We saw that in Syria. They go places where there's chaos and they reap the reward of selling weapons to add fuel to that fire. There should be an arms embargo and see if we can get the Russians to go along. We need to, again, their money matters. So go after their businesses, go after their sources, where they do banking, go after anywhere else they possibly can get access to funds. Go after, frankly, the families, and because their families go to Singapore or Thailand for healthcare or education around the world for first class, shut down their access to all the benefits of being the elite and basically corrupt elites who have made money off the country. Shut that down. You have to go after their reputation, and then you have to figure out a way to galvanize and coordinate an international response. And I talk in my piece about ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, needs to step up. I'm an Asianist, so we always used to tout ASEAN centrality. They want to be the center. They want to be a place where the great powers come and have conversations about the region to deal with regional problems. Well, folks, this is a regional problem. This is a failed state that is emerging, that is going to create havoc, even if they don't care about the humanitarian, which is a moral tragedy if they don't care about that. But even if they don't care about that, I think they would care about the implications of a failed state for refugee flows, for health implications, for trafficking implications, that they should be bringing together Japan, India, the United States, China, and themselves to come up with a coordinated approach that both turns on the pressure, as I've talked about, but also engages the military to tell them, you need a way out. You need to stop this, or else we will not legitimize you. We will not give you political credibility. Don't expect it to be business as usual, but we do want to help you with a way out to get, and figure out that back door. They need a way out, unfortunately. If they're pushed to the corner, they'll just be like Syria and they'll fight their way and destroy the country to save themselves. But we need a coordinated, much more urgency in the international community, much more vision to work on this together. And then ultimately, as I've talked about earlier, a solution to the problems of Myanmar, all the internal problems, building trust among the different components. That's going to be hard, but at least stop the violence and start a process to get things back on a track.
How possible do you think it is that the United Nations will actually pass a resolution? Maybe in that context, talk a little bit, if you would, about China and India's involvement in this current violence and whether it's in their interest to see it stop. And are they at loggerheads over Myanmar?
Well, I do think it's in their interest. I think it's all of their interest for this to stop. It is not in their, even China's interest, but we can be quite cynical about China and the world. But even in this case, they don't want to have a failed state on their long border, 1,400 kilometer border, a very porous border. They will reap the reward, as it were, of that, whether it's drug trafficking or human trafficking or refugee flows. And they had it pretty good, even under Aung San Suu Kyi, where they had investments there. They had, after the Rohingya crisis, where the West was alienated towards Aung San Suu Kyi to a great degree in the government. The Chinese were very happy with their relationship with Aung San Suu Kyi. And she would talk about, well, we can always turn to China if the West doesn't want to deal with us, which was unhelpful. Meanwhile, the military, it's not as if the military is much better. They had a harder line towards China. They were very worried about Aung San Suu Kyi and China to a degree, but the Chinese also, they underwrite, the Chinese do, some of the ethnic conflicts. They give weapons and they support some of the ethnic armed groups that are fighting the military. So it's not as if the military has any positive view towards China or China towards the military. So it's a very complicated situation there of who's on what side. But I do not believe it's in China's interest for this to continue. I do think, though, that China does have an interest that the UN not be involved in the internal affair of another country where the people are rising up against them, against the government. They're very neuralgic because they live in a glass house of the United Nations being assertive on political affairs, internal political affairs of a country. But the real problem on this, I mean, the Chinese have actually voted for resolutions in the UN Security Council condemning or calling for an end to violence. It's the Russians in particular that are blocking arms embargoes and that kinds of thing, because, and I think the Chinese did with them, because that hard action by the Security Council comes at their expense. And India is just concerned about Chinese influence in Myanmar. They're not a problem in shutting off the weapons. I think if there's an international arms embargo, they would go along with it, but they're afraid of losing influence to the Chinese in this sort of geopolitical contest over Myanmar.
I have one last question before I turn it over to Sandy and the audience. What I've noticed is that the international reporting on this, and there's a good deal, and that's good,
Yeah.
is that the protesters, to some degree, are becoming more violent themselves. They say there's no way out of this. They're beginning to get training in rural areas. I'm not sure who's doing the training. And in your article, you say it could be another Syria, because you're arguing that unless something happens, it'll be a failed state. How serious is this arming the civilians themselves against the military? How serious is it, and what is it likely to lead to if there's not effective international intervention?
Yeah, well, as you heard from the video, a vast majority of people, and I mean, basically all of them, even those you talk about, want a peaceful solution. They are committed to peaceful demonstrations and other civil disobedience, as we talked about. But there are some who, as discussed in the video, they talked about snipers. There are military snipers who are sitting up in a building and shooting people in the head, and consciously doing that, trying to hit them in the head, hit them in the back. They're just impunity, shooting into houses, children being murdered for nothing more than walking to the wrong place. Just walking into a woods, a military person sees it and shoots the child dead. I mean, that's just absolutely horrible. So, of course, some people will say we have to fight back, or I want to fight back alongside the ethnic groups, the ethnic armed organizations that are now mobilizing to fight back and break the ceasefires, which, you can argue that both ways, and whether that is leverage on the military to some degree. But you're right, who's going to train these folks? Over time, that just leads to what has been the scourge of Myanmar for 70 years, which is just violence, 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 guns, weapons everywhere. You know it from Africa, you know it from your experience, and it doesn't work. It's not going to succeed in making a better Myanmar, and it complicates any solution after the fighting is done. So, but yes, that is starting to happen, that people are losing faith in the peaceful and turning to protecting themselves against a military that is showing no signs of lessening the violence.
Really, Derek, thank you so much. It's been so informative. You have such a wonderful depth of knowledge about the whole region, Myanmar as well. I really appreciate your insights, that I know our audience very much does. I think, like you, we have to have more international action, but I'm not sanguine about it. I'm afraid that the United States is going to be distracted by Russia, by Afghanistan, which could turn pretty messy. But I hope you continue to push the world to take an interest in this tragedy.
Yeah, and just very quickly, I know there are questions. I do want to do justice to them, but the Biden administration has talked about a few things that are critical to its sort of Biden doctrine. One is American exercising leadership again in the world with humility. Second is leaning on allies and partners to work with us on this. And third is values and democracy as being a centerpiece of American interest. And Myanmar really is, and the coup coming February 1st, 10 days after or so after the inauguration, is the first test of this. So I think they are very much putting this towards the top of the agenda. There are a lot of other things happening that are urgent that get to the inbox, but they have, we'll see how much they leverage the summit with the Japanese on Friday, but they did it through the Quad, the US, Japan, India, Australia vehicle. And in every statement I see, they talk about this. They make this an issue. So I think they're doing what they can. And I suggested in my piece that it can't be enough through the normal bureaucracy. They don't even have their team in place yet. They're still getting people, confirmed by the Senate. So they need a special envoy, someone specially designated 24/7, as I was before I was ambassador, to go out and deal with the capitals in the region and try to help with this effort. I agree with you. It's hard to be sanguine about the impact, but you have to try. And I agree with you. I'm sure you'll agree. We must try, and we must do a bit more.
I completely agree. before we come back to some specific issues in Myanmar, Derek, let's talk about, your belief in terms of building back democratically across the region. Of course, we've had some troubling developments in Hong Kong. I suspect we're about to have more troubling developments in Afghanistan. Can you speak more broadly to, the movement towards democracy in the region and what some of the prospects and obvious challenges are?
Well, there are two different concepts in essence that you put there that are together. I've come up with this, my team and I have come up with this notion of build back democratically that plays off the build back better mantra of pandemic recovery and relief that the Biden administration has talked about. So we say there's only one way, that the pandemics are not just health crises, they're governance crises, both in their origins. We see from China, if they were more transparent, there's more, they were a more open society, a localized health situation might not have turned into a pandemic. So in prevention of pandemics, you need better governance and a better political system. But now, as we see the result of this carnage after a year of the pandemic or more, we're not close to the end of it, that what's happened is more polarization in countries. You're going to see the economics where the haves have done better, the have-nots have not. And that as we think about recovery, we have to embed the governance component in this. So that's build back democratically. Ensuring governance is part of this. The region is critical. And when I talk about the young people and young women of Myanmar, look to just next door, you're seeing a pattern in Thailand. They also had a coup in 2014. And there are young people taking to the streets that are trying to get their democracy back. And they've been sent to prison and otherwise had that muffled. And they're, and in Hong Kong, of course, a tragedy there of people taking to the streets, organized. And there's been, maybe people have heard of the Milk Tea Alliance. This is an alliance of young netizens, of young tech-savvy people who want to promote democratic values, values of human rights. And they have formed this alliance called Milk Tea. It's Taiwan people, and Taiwan, a beacon of democracy in the region, working with Hong Kongers and Thais, and now people in Myanmar, in solidarity, showing the three-finger salute of the Hunger Games. If anyone has watched the Hunger Games, that has now become a new, it shows American soft power, by the way. This is America at its best, where it is signaling freedom against oppression, resistance against authoritarianism. And they all are working together to see how they can fight back against the authoritarian wave in their region. So as people look at democracy and they'll say, well, the past 15 years, according to Freedom Watch, Freedom House and others, there's no doubt that all the measures suggest a regression of democracy that continues. And so people get depressed. And what we see from young people, from women, from societies that are opening up, from that resistance that still remains and the energy that is embedded. And what you're seeing is a reaction to that energy, but we need to support that energy. And that's what NDI does. That's what I think the Biden administration is looking to do. And I think every American should be behind in our own way.
So let me, on that very point of youth and youth protests, let me read a comment here from Jim Goggin, who again helped, or who did the audio recordings of that we played earlier. And he says, my continuing conversations with friends in Myanmar are becoming darker by the day. Noe, who is the woman who spoke first, says Gen Z is leading much of the street protests, with some members leaving cities to join ethnic armed groups. I sense stiffening resistance by everyone I talk with there. Is that sort of your feeling as well, that there's a resistance that's really stiffening and may well lead into conflict, into armed conflict, into full-on civil war?
Yeah, and that's what we were discussing with Vicki, is that by the day, both sides are getting more entrenched. Both sides are getting more polarized. The possibility of reconciliation gets harder. And the solutions become, as a result, as John Kennedy said, or paraphrasing, when you make peaceful resolution impossible, you make revolution inevitable. And so you're seeing that alienation. And we hoped in the early weeks after the coup that perhaps we can get a sense of a backdoor, the military seeing, wanting to step back, but they're not. They're digging in. And you're seeing the population, as I mentioned, saying we're not going back. So that's something where the two sides, in my view, are not going to be able to reconcile this between themselves. As proud as they are, as sovereign as they are, we have to be respectful of that, but they need help from the outside and those who can recognize where this is headed. We need to do right always with thinking, how do we support the Myanmar people ultimately in a return to democracy, but how do we as an international community try to prevent the worst from happening, because it's an obvious progression. We can see where it's headed. We must now with urgency get in the middle of it instead of simply watching it occur in slow motion.
Question here from Herb Thomas, and he was reflecting on the video we showed in that there was a person photographed with a mask featuring a UN flag as a head covering and a Chinese flag over the mouth like a muzzle. Despite Aung San Suu Kyi and the military dealing with China, does that image suggest popular suspicion that China is in fact siding against democracy here?
Yes, and there's a broad-based view inside the country, and I think the Chinese don't care if there's a democracy or not, and all they care about is protecting their own narrow interests in the country. They don't care about Myanmar, care about the Myanmar people. They care about their investments there, their business there, that this is their sphere of influence in their mind, and that they have their prerogatives protected, and that they're the first among so-called equals in Myanmar's desire to have equal relations with all. They want to be the first among those equals. And they want also access to the Indian Ocean. They want roads and rail lines, and they want the oil and gas that gets pumped from the Indian Ocean to go to Western China. That's all they really care about. And they make sure the United States doesn't have the overwhelming influence. So yes, the people see that, they recognize it, they know that the Chinese are not necessarily on their side. And you saw that, there's a Chinese flag with the shape of a hand over the person's mouth in the mask, which I thought was quite poignant, quite interesting. The bandana was the UN and the mask was China, or the mouth covering was China. So there is deep distaste for China, and frankly, China should recognize this. And that's another reason why they should be involved in finding a solution, because in the absence of a solution that works for the people of Myanmar, they'll be viewed as one of the obstacles to it. And that's certainly not in their long-term interest.
Do you think there's a possibility that the United States or other countries in Southeast Asia might informally recognize the CRPH government in exile?
Yeah, and let me also, for those who don't know, CRPH, it was mentioned, it was called Committee Representing the Pitu Latal. And the Pitu Latal is the Myanmar word for the parliament. So it's basically a committee representing those who were elected last November, duly elected, to serve in parliament. Instead of, they were supposed to sit on February 1st, but then they woke up on February 1st and they were under arrest or on the run because of the coup. So this is a committee that is seeking to represent the duly elected representatives of the country. They have formed a kind of shadow government, and that includes a foreign minister and such. They're trying to figure out how to overcome their own divisions from within. And the question of whether to recognize them formally or not, I think is something that, yeah, absolutely, I think they should be, if not formally recognize them as a government, then absolutely not recognize the military, and to definitely engage with and recognize a legitimacy of the CRPH as a representation of popular will. So if anything that the international community should do should be consistent with the popular will of the country, and therefore, welcome the CRPH and their representatives to have a conversation. So whether it's a formal recognition, informal recognition, absolutely engage them, listen to them as a priority, and absolutely do not give a seat at the table for the committee representing the military junta, to send a signal that we do not accept this, and we will not be silent about it.
Well, that dovetails well into a great question here from Diana Baker, who's asking, should we be looking at organizing some sort of action here in Santa Fe on behalf of folks in Myanmar? And Are there a list, are there ideas, are there things we should highlight in terms of Burmese army businesses and individuals that we might publicize and ask the public to boycott? I mean, I guess the bigger question is, what kinds of things can we here do, who are certainly concerned about the situation over there, to highlight some of the things that need address?
Well, I don't know specifically what networks there are. I know there are networks and they're localized. And I'm sure there is a campaign that is beginning to connect this and to publicize it. I can find out and I will send it to the council what I hear about how you can donate money, because the civil disobedience movement means people are not going to work. I mean, basically it's a war zone on the street and the economy has stopped. So the military has monies in various places. They can withstand this. The average citizen, even the pandemic had destroyed them. I mean, 60%, they have like poverty just, exploded because of the pandemic alone. And now they can't get access to their money in the banks. They can't get access to their livelihoods. So there is a humanitarian hunger potentially, and certainly a liquidity challenge in the country. So there are donations being made and donated to try to support the people of the country in the coming months so they can keep up their resistance. Certainly organizing, writing to the Congress, showing that support and that it's not being forgotten is very, very important. Providing material support somehow. It's very difficult to get things in. In terms of embargoes, the military businesses and those who are associated with them, first of all, the military businesses, there are not many that do export to the United States. There's not really a lot to be done there. There are businesses, you can do studies of which ones are doing business with military companies. For the most part, they are divesting at this point. But you can check and see who's not. And then there are oil companies that do business there that frankly have done some good things for local communities. So be very careful and mindful of not hitting the companies that want to do the right thing. And many of them are thinking, we now owe money to the government. Who's the government? Because according to the contract, they have to pay. So they're establishing potential escrow accounts or other ways of putting it into an account that is not accessible by the military. They're working that out as we speak, but doing some informed study of this is useful, and see if there are other councils around the country that you can work with in this regard. But I think it's wonderful for the Santa Fe community to be engaged.
Yeah, those are all great suggestions, and we'll certainly follow up with folks on this webinar who are interested in taking some of those actions. Let me ask you one final question. I want to harken back to Build Back Democratically. Yeah. We know that during the Trump administration, the projection of U.S. democracy abroad took a hit. We saw, authoritarian governments taking actions because they knew there wouldn't necessarily be a pushback or penalty from the United States. Has U.S. credibility on promoting democracy abroad suffered from that time? Are we, speak broadly to the role that the United States can play and should play and is playing right now in terms of promoting democracy abroad?
And that's a great question. I'm glad you asked it. I get it asked when I do these events because it's the elephant in the room. How can the United States talk about democracy when look at our own? Look what happened on January 6th. Look what's happened in recent years. How can we, quote, lecture others or impose democracy on others, et cetera, et cetera. And as I mentioned at the start, simply from an NDI perspective, you absolutely cannot impose democracy. Our chairman, NDI's chairman, is Madeleine Albright, former Secretary of State. She's my boss. She's wonderful. And she has a great line. She said, imposing democracy is an oxymoron. It has to be from the ground up. By definition, it has to be from, but we saw from Iraq and other things that you can move, military, you could try to militarily impose, but that's not what we're talking about. And we're not talking also about pressing, imposing it on others. We're about supporting it for those who seek it for themselves. And we must do it with humility, and no more so now than we ever have because of the problems here at home. And I think what we present are lessons learned. It's what NDI does. I think that's what the Biden administration talks about. We do this with humility, understanding we have our own problems, that democracy is always a work in progress. Democracy's work is never done. You hear it every day. If you watch cable, people talk about building toward a more perfect union. which is in our Constitution, which we have gone on much too long to build that union along racial lines, along religious lines, along all of our different fault lines. The time's up. We have to just do it. But we have lessons, and we can learn from others and what others are doing around the world to do better in terms of technology. There are others on the front lines of the Russian disinformation campaign. We can learn from how they are more resilient to disinformation over social media. We have to work with others on building, the conditions, the standards for our tech companies and for the use of our data. These are things we should be doing in partnership with other democracies. And again, not lecturing, but leading on it. Even if we know we're not perfect at this, we can still say we know democracy is the best form of government that we've yet devised, and not be shy about saying that, because it is true, is the only system that really can heal itself, can self-correct, and that protects the dignity of everyone if done the right way. And the only problems that democracies have is when we don't have strong enough institutions. We are not living up to the inclusion, the accountability, the transparency values that we say we must, and that citizens don't take responsibility for their civic duties of protecting the democracy. When we don't do that, we will have a faulty democracy that will fail. And we must re-engage, recommit ourselves in partnership, as the Biden administration talks about Summit for Democracy that they're talking about, and figure out what we all need to do and bring to the table what we ourselves need to do at home. And that's not just something we look to government to do. Everybody here in our communities, and whether in urban environments or rural environments or such, we all must be listening to each other, figure out a way to tolerate messages that we find quite intolerant or unacceptable in one way or another. But we got to find that unity again. And we must do it with others, because we don't have a moment to waste internationally. The Chinese are out there trying to shape a world according to their interests and their values. The Russians are trying to undermine. So we can't wait simply to get our own house in order to work with others abroad on this new twilight struggle, I would call it, that we are engaged in for democracy and human rights and justice for everyone equally around the world.
Well, Ambassador Derek Mitchell, thank you so much. Your insight and your wisdom is profound and much appreciated. And thank you so much, and best of luck in everything you're doing with NDI.
Thank you so much. And we can always use support with NDI, so we can look into that as well. But we're very, very helpful and grateful. I'm sorry for the council, for you, Sandy, and of course, Vicki. Just wonderful. I hope we meet in person someday. I've always been a great admirer, and it's really an honor to be on the same stage, as it were, with you.
Well, thank you so much. This has been wonderful, and please keep up all your wonderful work on behalf of democracy and on behalf of Myanmar.
Thank you.
And come to Santa Fe. We would love to have you in person.
Yes,
Anytime. I've never been. I'd love that. I would love it.
You consider yourself formally invited, and once all this pandemic lifts, we'll figure out how to do that. But thank you all so much. Thank you to Clayton as well. And I hope to see all of you on Wednesday, the 21st, when of course we have our annual gala with Jim Comey and Valerie Plame. And until then, have yourself a fine day. Bye-bye, everyone.